The storms of virulent anti-American protests, denunciation of imperialism and new colonialism, and the wearisome repetition of idealistic slogans following the U.S. action in Venezuela have been as overwhelming as they are predictable. Political leaders worldwide are inevitably compelled to voice the obligatory truisms on rule of law, respect for the UN Charter, and other equally vague maxims which politicians routinely utter in times like this to appear respectable. The now common phenomenon of various mobs representing justice, law, and righteousness have again taken to the streets of Western cities denouncing the U.S. action and, in the case of the U.S. protesters, upholding the cause of a despot and his regime, which spent decades in fanatical pursuit of inflicting grievous harm on those very people, their societies, and environments. The vast majority of the 7 million exiled Venezuelans are rejoicing, but large segments of the American population, in a stupor of its leftist ideology, are in fierce protest in defense of a brutal tyrant and his regime which entertained and supported within its territory numerous enemies of the U.S. and which spared no labor to find means of subverting the United States. The mindless parroting of the concept of international law is nothing new, just as other high-minded concepts such as resolution through diplomatic means, meaningful dialogue, act with restraint, when it is manifest to common sense that such means have been exhausted and rendered impossible, are regular banalities. So too is this notion of international law, a safe statement frequently employed by politicians to sound virtuous, empty of substance but plausible nevertheless. What exactly is this international law? Who defines it? Who administers it and enforces compliance? Which major country or power at some time or another hasn't taken liberties with its interpretation? The UN Charter, the commonly invoked document in all its vague sanctity, is now being bandied about freely by political leaders hard-pressed to take sides and avoiding a clear stand as much as possible. Academic elites who prescribe ideologies which appertain only to their rarefied world of comfortable academic halls for discoursing on intellectual fantasies, the mainstream media which is consumed by one obsession, that of discrediting Donald Trump, the multitudes of organized leftist campaigners, and the thousands of less organized clueless do-gooders, are all now in a high-strung fever of outrage at this flagrant act in violation of the little understood but much revered code of international law. The more devious among this horde know and quietly forget or evade the fact that the UN itself is a gravely flawed and deficient institution that's often held up to ridicule. The UN is now a colossal, corrupt, and ravening organization of little merit or worth to the world. Besides ceaseless meetings and mindless debates in forums and sub-organizations providing a highly privileged lifestyle to a large number of bureaucrats, its jurisdiction and influence in matters of real value to the world are preposterously weak and futile. In the luxurious habitats it has designed for itself, unending discourses on political ideals and ineffectual projects, endless squabbling among members and factions, undignified scrambling for benefits and power, and passing of resolutions having no power of enforcement are all that happen. Which country among those clamoring for judgment against this U.S. action invoking international law can self-assuredly claim not to have violated these laws sometime in the past when its national interest overrode such scruples? Russia when it annexed the Crimea in 2014. China, which disdainfully kicked aside the UN laws of the sea and is continuing to intimidate and harass daily smaller nations in the South China Sea. What about the enormous number of conflicts, violations of human rights, and acts of blatant harm to innocent civilians in the world, in Africa, in Yemen, in Haiti, where the UN and its laws are patently hopeless? Who talks of the Armenians of the Nagorno-Karabakh enclave, who in 2024 were summarily expelled when Azerbaijan acquired the territory by military means? Hardly anyone knows or is bothered by such and a dozen similar issues. There are no rampaging masses of crazed activists fighting for those causes, which in reality have caused immeasurably more suffering and death than the present infringement of international law in Venezuela. Whenever the U.S. is involved, it unavoidably evokes mass interest and rancor from every quarter. Just as invoking international law is a defense and protection for smaller states, it should also afford a bigger power the rights and the self-same privileges when an injustice is done against it. What if a smaller state is alleged to be an offender? What recourse does a large state have under the same laws when it's been subjected to multiple forms of offense? Actions injurious to the national interests of a large state can well occur by the policies of a smaller, poorer state. Actions of an undeniably hostile nature, like granting of territory to be used as staging grounds for terrorist acts, of allowing itself to be a proxy of a larger hostile power, etc. When a rogue state, acting with indifference to these same laws, using clandestine methods, succeeds for decades in trespassing on another nation, infiltrating that country with thousands of criminal agents bringing various pernicious infestations to that country, it goes unnoticed by the world and therefore is not subjected to any form of public judgment. It also allows easy means of escape to the perpetrator, what's unknown or unseen being dismissed as unproven, speculative, and malicious. However, when a prominent power conducts a retaliatory action, even in the most justifiable circumstances of hostile intrusions by a smaller state, that action will come under extreme scrutiny and incrimination, and the smaller state will automatically be assigned the role of victim and oppressed, and absolved of all offenses of the past. The loud condemnation from the dull and unimaginative anti-American media and opportunistic statesmen to whom mandatory denunciation of the U.S. is necessary to appease their voters, is predictable. But vast numbers of American people, blinded by hatred for its leadership, from a perverted sense of ideological superiority, denouncing their own country and upholding the cause of a brutal regime, is staggering to perceive. It is astounding to any reasonable observer that multitudes of people in present-day U.S., a nation faced with malignant threats from a range of tyrannical powers with boundless hegemonic ambitions, should be this eagerly welcoming of ideologies raised and fostered elsewhere. Poisonous ideologies, imported by leftist organizations, funded and controlled by the unseen hands of rabidly anti-American fanatics. These are fanatical forces already having a secure foothold in the U.S., a fact made possible from its own, past, foolishly liberal notions of equality and multiculturalism that are zealously committed to subversion and destruction from within. Intoxicated by a newfound propensity for a leftist ideology, which has failed disastrously everywhere it was attempted, these daydreaming anarchists seek to obliterate every ideal, every precept of freedom, of Christianity, of decency and dignity, derived over centuries from the foundational precepts of Western civilization. A civilization of immeasurable learning, culture, and refinement is being devoured from within Western society by organized and random agents of forces of evil, evil from countries that have for a century repressed and caused death and suffering to millions of their own populations. This is the mind-numbing utopian ideal of the modern left.